The thing about a blood trail in the Wisconsin forest in late October is that it reads like a language. Any deer hunter who has tracked a hit animal through brush and standing corn knows what I mean. You learn to read what the blood tells you. High spatter along the side of a sapling means a lung hit. Low drops pressed into the pine duff mean a leg wound. The way it pools tells you where the animal stopped, and the direction it runs tells you where it went. Dale Voigt had been reading blood trails in the Chequamegon Nicolet for 22 years by the time he followed the last one. And the reason he understood almost immediately that this one wasn't telling a normal story was because he knew the language well enough to know when something had learned to write in it. Dale found me the way people in his situation usually find me, through a forum post, a referral from a referral, a chain of messages from people who carry a story they can't tell at a cookout but can't stop carrying around either. He emailed in the fall of 2022. We talked on the phone 3 times before he agreed to meet in person. He drove down from Green Bay to do it, brought a bag of coffee from a place he liked on the west side, and sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours, laying out everything that happened to him in October of 2017 inches. Forest County, Wisconsin. The first thing I noticed was that he didn't embellish. When he got to a detail he wasn't certain about, he said so. When I pushed him on something he couldn't confirm, he pushed back and told me he didn't know rather than filling in the gap with something that would make the story cleaner. He gave me what he had and let the holes sit. The second thing I noticed was that he still hadn't been back up there since 5 years. His lease had expired and he let it go and took up ice fishing instead, which he told me he found deeply boring. He said boring was fine. Dale Voigt was 47 years old at the time. He'd worked as a machinist at the Georgia Pacific corrugated container plant on the east side of Green Bay since his mid-20s, one of those jobs you take for the health insurance and the steady schedule and find yourself still doing 20 years later because the work is honest, the pay is decent, and you've learned every quirk of the machinery until it runs in the back of your head like a second language. He was compact and careful in the way of men who work with tolerances all day. He didn't waste words. His hands, when he set down the coffee cup, were still and flat on the table. He'd been hunting the same block of Forest County since he was 25. A piece of land he leased access to from a timber company, 80 acres of private ground that shared a boundary with the Chequamegon Nicolet National Forest on 2 sides, up in the northern part of the Nicolet unit, roughly 12 miles north of Crandon. If you've never been in Forest County in October, here's what it is. It's some of the least traveled terrain in the upper Midwest. Rhinelander is 45 minutes south, and the further north you go from there, the thinner the roads get, and the longer the distances between anything. Cell signal in the part of the forest where Dale hunted was non-existent. He'd never cared. He wasn't going up there to be reachable. The timber company's rotation logging had worked through parts of his 80 acres over the years, which meant the deer browse was excellent. Young aspen and poplar growth mixed with older pine and hemlock stands, the kind of edge cover that holds mature whitetail bucks. He'd taken deer there every season for 20 years running. Most of them within 300 yards of the same ladder stand on the eastern edge of the property. He knew that ground the way you know a house you've lived in for a long time. In the dark, in the wrong weather, by feel. He set up a Stealth Cam G45 NG trail camera on a game trail about 80 yards north of camp, mounted to a white oak that had a fresh rub on its base. The G45 NG runs on 8 AA batteries and uses a no-glow infrared flash, which means it fires without emitting visible light. He'd used that same camera on that same trail for 3 seasons by October 2017. He had a second stand set up on the western edge of the lease near a creek bottom. The drive up from Green Bay takes about 2.5 hours in normal October traffic. Dale took 41 north out of the city, caught Highway 8 east out of Rhinelander, and then dropped onto county roads for the last leg, the pavement going from smooth to patched to gravel in stages that marked the county's infrastructure budget as much as its geography. The Silverado, loaded with camp gear and a coonhound in the cab, made the transition without complaint. Burl had made this drive enough times to settle in fast, chin on the center console, watching the dark of the headlights on the asphalt with no particular interest. Dale told me the dog was good company in the specific way that dogs that have been around a long time are good company, not demanding any input, just present. The Nicolay unit in late October smells like cold pine and wet leaf mold, and if you get far enough from the road, a quality deeper and harder to name, mineral underneath the organic, like the smell of iron in old water. The days are short by then, full dark by 6, dawn not until nearly 7. The time between is actual dark, not suburban dark, but the kind of dark that closes in fast from all sides when you're 12 miles from the nearest highway. Dale said he'd never found the dark bothersome. He'd been sleeping in the camper out here since his 20s, and the dark was just the dark. The first morning, Saturday the 21st, he was in his stand on the eastern edge of the property before first light. The stand was a summit ladder stand, 16 feet up, a mature red maple, with a shooting lane cut through the brush to the southeast that opened onto a 40-yard window across a travel corridor between 2 hemlocks. He'd sat that stand in all weathers for most of 2 decades. He knew the sounds it made in wind, knew which branches moved in a breeze, and which moved only when weight was on them further up the tree. He knew the deer in that corridor moved east in the morning and west in the evening, and he knew by around 6:15 whether the morning was going to produce movement or not by the quality of the air. That Saturday produced deer. The young doe he saw came through the corridor at 7:40, moving east, perfectly calm. He watched her for 12 minutes before she put her head down to browse and drifted off south. The 4-point came through an hour later, working a scrape at the base of one of the hemlocks. Dale watched him too and let him walk. He was back in camp by 9:30, coffee still warm on the stove, the forest quiet in the way that it goes quiet after the morning movement window closes and the deer bed up for the day. The next 2 days were much like the first. He hunted mornings from the east stand and afternoons from the creek bottom stand on the west edge of the lease. He saw deer on 3 of the 4 sits. He ate well. He'd pre-cooked a pot of chili and vacuum-sealed it at home, brought a bag of sourdough, cheese, salami. He read his book in the afternoons. He checked the Stealth Cam SD card on Monday after lunch and pulled it into his laptop. 38 images, mostly doe movement, and 1 image of the black bear passing through at 11 in the evening, moving south to north across the game trail with the lazy, slightly rolling gait of a bear that had been eating well. 280 pounds, Dale estimated. He'd seen this bear before, same individual, he thought, based on size and the slight drag pattern in its left rear foot. He noted it in his camp log, which he kept in a spiral notebook, and put the card back in the camera. Tuesday afternoon, he walked the back half of the property, a 3-hour circuit through the western timber, checking for sign. Fresh rubs on cedar saplings, scrapes worked up in the leaf litter under a big poplar, deer tracks in the mud at the seasonal spring on the northwest corner of the lease. The forest was in the full lean of autumn, most of the canopy stripped to bare branches except the pines and hemlocks, the light moving through in long flat shafts that turned the pine needle floor amber. He jumped a doe and fawn from a brush pile. He found a dead porcupine near the lease boundary. A predator had killed it, though what kind he couldn't determine from what remained. He left it alone and noted it in the log. Wednesday and Thursday were quiet sits. He saw nothing from the east stand Wednesday morning. Thursday morning he had a shooter buck, a big-bodied 8-point, wide antlers with good mass, the kind of deer you spend 20 years of October mornings waiting to see in your shooting lane, come through the corridor at 7:15. It walked broadside at 31 yards for a window of about 10 seconds, and then turned and went back the way it had come, pushed by something Dale never saw. He watched the corridor for another 40 minutes. The buck did not return. He hiked back to camp in a state of calm frustration that was, he told me, a very familiar feeling. That's hunting. You wait, and then the moment either comes or it doesn't, and then you wait again. He didn't think about anything unusual those first 6 days. The forest felt the way it always felt. The dark at night was the usual dark. Burl slept well and ate his meals and showed no signs of distress. Whatever was in those pines by the time Dale arrived, whatever had established its awareness of the camp and the man and the dog in the truck bed, it wasn't announcing itself. It was watching, and he had Burl. The blue-tick coonhound was 7 years old that fall, 68 pounds, black and tan with the characteristic ticking pattern across his sides and flanks. Technically trained for bear hunting, but Dale said he'd retired Burl from active field work 2 seasons earlier after a knee injury that never healed completely right. Burl came to deer camp not because he was useful in any practical sense. A coonhound at a deer camp is mostly an advertisement to every whitetail within half a mile that something is nearby, but because Dale lived alone in Green Bay and the dog had been the only consistent living presence in the apartment for 6 years, and leaving him behind for a week felt wrong. Every October trip since Burl was a puppy, the dog had ridden in the cab of the Silverado on the drive north, sitting with his chin on the center console the whole way up, Highway 8 from Rhinelander to the county roads past Crandon. That was the trip. That was the partnership. A man and his dog driving north in the dark to a piece of ground they both knew well. At night in camp, Dale tied Burl to the rear hitch of the truck on a 12-foot nylon rope with a brass snap clip attached to the dog's collar. Burl slept in the truck bed under an old Carhartt blanket. He'd done this without incident for 6 seasons. The dog had never tested the rope, and the rope had never failed. Dale drove into the lease on Friday, the 20th of October, 2017. His standard pattern was 2 weekends. Arrive Friday evening, hunt through Sunday, drive home, return the following Friday. The first 6 days of the trip followed the usual rhythm. He saw deer from his stand on Saturday and Monday mornings. A young doe, a 4-point that was a year from being worth a tag, nothing he wanted to put an arrow through. He hiked the back half of the property on Tuesday afternoon doing a general walk, checking scrapes and rubs, getting a sense of where buck sign was concentrating. The stealth cam was collecting images, mostly doe movement, a spike buck on 2 separate nights, and a black bear that passed through on Tuesday at 11 in the evening. Normal Forest County fall. The night before the incident was Thursday, October 26th. He was back in camp by 5:30, made a skillet of kielbasa and canned tomatoes on the Coleman stove, ate standing up reading a book he'd downloaded before he lost signal, a history of the Green Bay Packers' offensive line strategies through the 1960s and 1970s, which he'd been working through for 2 seasons, fed Burl a measured cup of kibble at 6, tied him to the truck at 6:30 with the snap clip, watched the dog nose around the camp perimeter for a few minutes before settling into the truck bed, checked him once more at 9. Burl was lying under his blanket, eyes already half closed, showing no sign of anything wrong. The temperature dropped to 31 degrees Fahrenheit that night. Dale said he was warm enough, the propane heater in the camper working properly. He fell asleep fast, the way he always did in camp. The physical tiredness of standing on a platform in the cold for hours settles you down hard. I want to stay with that last evening for a moment, because Dale described it in more detail than I've given it here, and the detail matters. When he'd checked on Burl at 9 and found him already drowsing under the Carhartt blanket, he stood there for a few minutes. He did this every night in camp, not out of worry. The dog had slept outside in colder weather than this, and knew how to position himself in the truck bed to stay warm, but out of a habit built over 6 years of doing exactly this. They'd been coming up here together for 6 years. Burl had been a puppy the first time Dale loaded him into the Silverado for the drive north, all legs and ears, confused by the smells of the forest in a way he grew out of fast. By the 2nd or 3rd year, the dog's behavior in camp had become part of the rhythm of the trip, in the same way the coffee on the Coleman stove was part of the rhythm, something that made the camp feel like camp rather than like a man sitting alone in the dark. Dale told me he remembered pausing that Thursday evening at the truck and looking up at the sky. No clouds. The temperature was going to keep dropping. The stars through the pine canopy had that sharp, slightly blue quality they get in cold air when there's no humidity to blur them. He could see the Big Dipper clearly and most of Orion coming up in the east, which is about as late in the year as you can hunt in Wisconsin before the season turns toward gun and the woods fill up with orange. He stood there for probably 2 minutes. Burl's breathing was even and slow under the blanket. He hadn't eaten all of his kibble that evening, which was slightly unusual. The dog had a good appetite, but not alarming. Older dogs skipped meals sometimes. Dale tucked the edge of the blanket back where it had shifted, the way you tuck a blanket over someone without waking them. Then he went inside. He told me he thought nothing of it at the time. He doesn't say that to indicate he should have. He says it because I've asked him more than once whether anything felt wrong that evening, whether there was any quality to the night that in retrospect he could identify as a signal. He said no. The forest was the forest. The stars were the stars. Burl was asleep in the truck bed the same way he'd been asleep in the truck bed the same night of the previous 6 years. He felt the same thing he always felt in camp after a week of hunting, tired in a useful way, ready for sleep, at ease in the specific way of a man, in a place he knows well and returns to because it returns him to himself. He told me he didn't dream anything. He said that specifically, unprompted, which is the kind of detail people include when they've spent time wondering about it. He said that if something had come into his camp in the night and moved around outside the thin aluminum walls of the camper, he heard nothing. Nothing that his sleeping brain registered as worth waking up for. Whatever came in, it came quietly, and it came with enough awareness of what would disturb the man inside the camper that nothing disturbed him. There's a thing that happens in very quiet, very cold forest nights that Dale had described to me earlier in our conversation as one of the things he liked about hunting alone up there. He called it the kind of quiet where you can hear the temperature drop, the specific creak of pine trunks as the cold settles into the wood, the crack of a branch somewhere far off as moisture contracts, the settling sounds of the forest going dormant. He'd fallen asleep to that sound for 20 years. And found it reliable and good. On Thursday night, by his reconstruction, all of that was proceeding normally right up until the moment it wasn't, until something moved through his camp with enough care that the sounds it made were indistinguishable from the forest, doing its usual work in the cold. He woke at 4:47 in the morning. He knew the time because he looked at his watch, an old Casio on his left wrist that he wore in camp because his phone battery was down to 11% and he was rationing it. He had no particular reason to wake up. He hadn't heard anything. He just opened his eyes in the dark of the camper and was completely awake, which hadn't happened to him before in camp. He lay there for 30 seconds, heard nothing outside, made coffee on the Coleman. By 5:15, he was dressed in his hunting layers, wool base, flannel, insulated vest, canvas outer jacket, blaze orange hat, and stepped outside to check on Burl before heading to his stand. The truck was parked 30 feet from the camper door. Dale walked around to the driver's side and shone his headlamp into the truck bed. The bed was empty. He stood there, looked at the blanket, folded back as if the dog had climbed out from under it, looked at the rope where it connected to the trailer hitch. The rope was still there, full length, both ends present, the bowline knot at the hitch intact. He followed the rope to the loose end and held it up under his headlamp. The brass snap clip hung clean and undamaged on the end. He turned it over in his hand. The thumb lever was intact. The gate opened and closed properly. The clip showed no damage, no bent metal, no corrosion, no sign of force. The mechanism had been opened and the clip had been removed from Burl's collar, while the collar was presumably still on Burl's neck. A dog cannot open a brass snap clip. They don't have the manual dexterity to work the thumb release, and even if they did, a 68-pound coonhound doesn't reach the hitch end of a rope anyway. The clip doesn't come loose on its own. Something had walked up to that truck between 9 at night and 4:47 in the morning, released the snap clip, and taken the dog, and Dale had slept through all of it. He stood holding the clip under his headlamp for a long time. He called for Burl, voice low at first, then louder. Nothing. He walked the camp perimeter in a wide circle with his light, checking for the dog. The ground was frost-stiffened, hard to read for tracks in the dark. He found the blood on the north edge of the clearing, approximately 40 yards from where the truck was parked, at the point where the mowed grass margin gave way to leaf litter and the first line of aspen saplings. 3 drops on the frost, round and dark, about the diameter of a nickel. He crouched and looked at them under his headlamp. They weren't fresh. The surfaces had darkened and the edges had gone from wet bright to matte, an hour old at minimum. 2 hours was more likely. He swept the headlamp north into the tree line. Another drop. 8 inches past the cluster. Then another at roughly the same interval. The trail continued north into the forest. He went back to the camper, put on his hunting pack, put his fixed blade knife on his belt. He picked up his bow. He told me he didn't think through the decision. He just didn't want to go into the forest alone without it, and walked back to the blood and started north. In the first 300 yards, the trail was easy to follow, drops every 12 to 18 inches, moving through aspen and birch at the edge of the clearing and then into the older timber as the slope rose slightly. The morning light was beginning to separate the gray from the black by the time he was 200 yards in, just enough light to turn down his headlamp. He called for Burl twice more. Nothing came back. The forest was completely quiet. No squirrels, no woodpeckers starting up, no crows, which is the kind of quiet that means something large had moved through recently. Dale said he noticed it and filed it and kept moving. October forests in northern Wisconsin, after a cold night, carry their own specific smell. Frost-killed leaves releasing the last of their stored moisture, the sharp green of the few remaining ferns, the resin of pine and hemlock competing with the alkaline tang of mineral-wet soil exposed by squirrel digging. Dale described walking through it as the kind of sensory environment that normally settled him, familiar, specific to that piece of ground, the smell of 2 decades of October mornings. But at 300 yards into the forest, following a blood trail with no explanation he could accept, the smell had changed. Underneath the familiar was something else, an animal musk that he first cataloged as deer, but that didn't resolve into deer the longer he moved through it. It was bigger than deer smell, more dense, and it was directional, stronger to the north, the way a scent strengthens when you're moving toward the source. He paused at one point and looked at his surroundings. Mature pine on his left, younger birch growth to the right where a section of the lease had been logged about 7 years earlier. No tracks in the duff that he could read, no sign of anything watching him. But the musk was in the air and the forest was wrong in the way of a forest that is not empty. And Dale said that by 350 yards in, some part of him had started counting steps, not as a conscious decision, just doing it automatically, the way a person starts to take note of the distance back to a known point when they're moving into unfamiliar territory. 352 steps back to the blood's origin at the tree line. 338 steps to the camper. 739 steps to the truck. He kept going north. At roughly 400 yards, he stopped and crouched over the trail and looked at a cluster of drops more carefully. Here is what he noticed, and what he told me about with a particular precision that I think about every time I come back to his account. An injured dog moving on its own through a forest does not produce a blood trail like this. A wounded animal's movement is erratic. It pauses, it lunges, it slows and speeds as the pain and exhaustion shift. The drops reflect that. They cluster in the places where the animal moves slowly. They thin out where it panics. They smear in the direction of travel when the wound is low enough to drag against a surface. An animal with a serious enough wound to produce a continuous trail also tends to leave wound fur, the hair that loosens around a puncture or tear. Dale had tracked dozens of wounded deer and 3 wounded bears over 22 seasons. He knew exactly what a real blood trail from a moving animal looked like. This trail had none of those characteristics. The drops were round, unsmeared. They were evenly spaced across wildly different terrain, across pine duff, across exposed tree roots, across a short stretch of bare mineral soil, which meant the spacing wasn't a function of the ground surface, it was a function of the source. There was no fur. There was nothing displaced, nothing knocked loose, no scuff marks from an animal crawling or dragging. No depression patterns in the frost from a body lying down to rest. What Dale was reading was not the trail of Burl dragging himself north through the forest. What he was reading was the trail of something carrying Burl north through the forest. Holding the dog in a way that allowed blood to fall at a controlled, steady interval, almost measured, at the pace of something walking upright, he stood up and looked north. The trail continued through the pines. He took a long breath of 31-degree air, cold enough to make his sinuses ache, and kept going. There's a specific knowledge that experienced trackers develop that doesn't have a formal name, but that every serious woodsman I've spoken to describes in roughly the same terms. It's the ability to read the narrative in a trail the way a reader reads a text, not just extracting individual data points, but feeling the flow between them, the way one drop relates to the next, and what the relationship says about the mind behind the movement. Dale had been building that knowledge for 2 decades. He could look at a deer trail in fresh snow and tell you whether the animal was walking, trotting, or running, whether it was a doe with fawns or a lone buck, whether it was moving purposefully or feeding as it went. He could read a coyote's overnight circuit from the scatter of its tracks in the duff and tell you roughly where it had paused and what it had been investigating. He'd taught his nephew to track on this piece of ground, and the first thing he'd told the kid was that a trail is a story with a beginning, a middle, and an intended end, and your job is to figure out what the end was before you arrive at it. By 400 yards in, Dale had enough data to know what story this trail was telling. The even spacing across varied surfaces meant a controlled carry, not a drag. The absence of fur meant no open wound site, creating mechanical hair loss. The bipedal print at the drainage crossing meant the carrier was moving on 2 limbs, which left its arms free, which meant Burl was being held against the body or carried across a shoulder, and in either case, the blood was falling from a single contained wound at a consistent height above the ground. The height and the spacing put the source at roughly 5 to 6 feet off the ground, consistent with a large bipedal carrier moving at a walking pace, and the direction was unvarying. Every trail he'd ever followed in 22 years responded to terrain. Animals pathfind around obstacles. They go uphill where the gradient is easiest. They skirt fallen timber and dense brush. This trail went through things rather than around them. He'd had to climb over a tangle of fallen birch around 300 yards, a blowdown he'd been meaning to clear from the lease for 2 seasons. The blood drops didn't divert at the obstacle. The trail went directly through it, because whatever was carrying Burl had the size and the strength to make a straight line north, the easiest line available. He filed all of this and stood at the 400-yard mark, and he knew, in the way trackers describe knowing things, that the trail was made to be followed. The drops were sized and spaced to be visible and followable in low morning light for a person on foot moving at a human walking pace. They were not so close together as to suggest an animal bleeding out that needed to be followed quickly. They were not so far apart as to risk losing the trail. The word Dale used, and he used it sitting at my kitchen table 5 years later, was calibrated. He said it twice. He said it the way people repeat a word when they want you to understand it was the most accurate word available. At the half-mile mark, the terrain changed. The flat mixed timber floor of the younger growth gave way to a slope, and at the bottom of the slope was a seasonal drainage channel, a wide, shallow trough that ran with snowmelt in spring and went dry by summer. The bed was exposed silt and clay, pale and fine in the morning light, still soft enough in early autumn to hold impressions. Dale came down the slope and crossed the drainage in 2 steps, and when he stepped up onto the far bank and looked down at the clay, he stopped. There was a print, roughly 14 inches in length. 5 toes, with the outer 2 set noticeably wide and the 3 central toes positioned forward. The heel impression was deep. He crouched and looked at the weight gradient across the print's length. The way the depth of the impression changes from heel to ball tells you whether the animal was moving on all 4s or on 2 limbs. The rear of this print was the deepest, with the weight transferring forward through the midfoot to a lighter toe strike. The architecture was bipedal. Something had stepped through this clay on a single foot, walking on 2 legs, with its full weight pressing down through 1 stride. The claw marks at the front of the print extended 1.5 inches past the end of the toe pads. Not the compact, curved claw impression of a black bear. Dale had seen hundreds of bear tracks. Bear claws compress into a rounded arc, conforming to the pad. These marks were elongated, parallel, almost straight, the way you'd draw it if someone asked you to draw claw marks. 3 inches of mark, extending beyond 3 of the 5 toes, deep enough that the clay had pushed up on either side of each groove. He took out his phone, 10% battery, and photographed the print. He stood up and looked north at the blood trail, continuing into the pines. He had covered, by his estimation, slightly more than half a mile. He was alone, in timber he knew well, in the low light of a Forest County October morning. He had 1 bar of charge on his phone and no cell signal, and a bow on his back and a blood trail made by something that had opened a snap clip in the dark. He stayed at the print for several minutes. He told me he was doing the kind of thinking that people describe as processing, but which really just means standing somewhere and not being able to move while your brain works through a set of facts that your body has already understood. His body was telling him to turn around. He could feel that clearly, a specific physical pressure in his chest that he associated retroactively with every other moment in his life where an instinct about a situation had been correct. The time at the paper mill when a colleague had ignored a hydraulic warning and Dale had moved 3 steps to the left before the press arm failed. The time he'd been bow hunting a different piece of ground a decade earlier and something had felt wrong about a ravine in a way that had no logic, and he'd moved and found an old mine shaft not 15 feet from where he'd been standing. The instinct and the love for the dog were running in opposite directions. He crossed the drainage and kept going north. From the drainage to the mile mark, the timber got older and the canopy closed. He was in mature white pine and hemlock now, the kind of old-growth corridor that the timber company's rotation logging had left alone because the trees were too spread out to be economically worth harvesting. The floor was deep with decades of pine needle accumulation, springy underfoot, the kind of surface that swallows sound. His steps were nearly silent. He noticed this, and then noticed that it also meant that whatever had walked ahead of him on this same floor would have made no sound at all. The blood drops continued. At the mile mark, he stopped and looked at the trail ahead and then looked at the trail behind him, the vanishing line of small dark marks receding into the amber gloom of the pine corridor. He had the thought, and this is one of the details he came back to several times in our conversation, that the trail looked designed, not in an overcomplicated way. Designed the way a functional thing is designed, for a specific purpose, efficiently, without waste. Someone who knew how a deer hunter followed blood had laid this trail to be followed by a deer hunter. The spacing was right. The direction was consistent. The drops were large enough to see in low morning light, but not so large as to suggest an animal that had already bled out. It was calibrated to be followed. He looked at it for a while and then he continued following it. The second bipedal print showed up at the edge of a patch of exposed sand under a pine that had fallen the previous winter, the root ball pulling up enough mineral soil to leave a sand depression. Same dimensions as the first, same claw architecture. This one was clearer. The sand had held the impression cleanly, and he could see the individual pad separations within the toe impressions. The inside of the foot was subtly arched, the print narrower in the middle than at the ball and the heel, indicating a plantigrade foot, a foot built for walking flat, rather than the digitigrade structure of a wolf or bear that walks on its toes. Whatever made these prints walk the way humans walk, heel-to-toe weight transfer across the full surface of the foot. He photographed it and moved on. He found 2 more prints over the next half-mile, both in soft ground, both consistent. At one point, between the second and third prints, he found a place where the blood drops were slightly closer together, 10 to 12 inches instead of 18, over a distance of about 30 feet. Not a stumble, not a shift in the carrier's pace, but a place where the drops had simply closed up slightly, the way they would if something was moving through a tighter piece of brush and had turned slightly sideways. The blood trail was being narrated to him in the margin changes, in the way it responded to terrain, and what it was narrating was the movement of something large, upright, and deliberate. At 1.5 miles, he went through a section of younger regrowth, where a wind throw event had knocked down a stand of mature pine sometime in the late 1990s. New aspens had filled in, close packed and still holding their leaves, yellow and orange, catching the morning light. The blood trail went through this, and Dale followed it, ducking under aspen branches, stepping over the root systems of the blown-down pines. The smell from before, the dense animal musk, was stronger here. He stopped once, and stood still and listened. Wind through the aspens, his own breath, nothing else. He came out the other side of the wind throw into the old timber again, and the creek bed was visible ahead. I want to stop here for a moment because what I've just described is the part of Dale's account where the picture becomes clear, and I think it's worth sitting with it before going further. What Dale was following wasn't the aftermath of something random. It wasn't Burl getting loose and injuring himself. Whatever entered that camp in the night, knew enough to move quietly through a space where a trained hunting dog was sleeping 20 feet from a man. It knew how a snap clip worked. It knew, or had observed, that the dog and the man were connected in the kind of way that would cause the man to follow a blood trail rather than drive to the nearest town and call for help. And it had laid that trail going in one direction, north, toward a location that was not Dale's camp and was not any road, toward a location that something else had chosen. By the time Dale understood the shape of what had happened, he was already more than halfway there. He told me he thought about turning around. He said he stood at that clay bank for a long time, and he knew, in whatever part of a person actually processes these things correctly, that going further was wrong. But Burl was his dog. 7 years. So he went further. I'll tell you what he found. The blood trail from the half-mile mark to the 2-mile mark continued in the same pattern, even drops, no fur, no disturbance to the ground, except the occasional bipedal impression in softer soil. Dale found 5 more prints over that stretch. Not always in obvious places. Once in a patch of sand at the edge of an old 2-track logging road that ran through the property's boundary. Once at the lip of a small seasonal spring where the earth stayed soft. Each time, the same architecture. 14 inches, 5 toes, bipedal weight distribution, 3-inch claw marks at the front. The temperature had come up slightly by the time he was at 1.5 miles, still below 40 degrees, but the light was full and the frost on the leaves had gone wet rather than stiff. He could see well. He'd been moving for just over an hour. The forest had been changing since around the mile mark. The timber went older, the canopy tighter, the light filtering down through mature white pine and hemlock that blocked a lot of the sky. The brush thinned out. You don't get much ground-level growth under a closed canopy, and the light had an amber quality from the pine needles layering the floor. The temperature under the canopy was a few degrees colder than in the open. The quiet was different too. The outer forest quiet had been the absence of what should have been there. This quiet was its own presence. The 2-mile mark, as close as Dale could estimate it, was a dry creek bed. Not a drainage channel like the one he'd crossed earlier. This was a wider, older bed, maybe 40 feet across, where a creek had run in another era and left behind a flat floor of packed gravel and sand before the water rerouted itself further north. The banks were 4 to 5 feet high on either side, red clay with exposed root systems hanging through the walls, and the whole channel was roofed over by a dense mat of interlocked pine branches from both banks. The light in the creek bed was low and diffuse. The sound was swallowed by the sand. Dale came down the north bank and stepped into the creek bed, and the first thing he saw was Burl's collar. It was lying in the sand 6 feet from the base of the bank. The collar was still buckled. The plastic side release buckle was done up, but the leather had been cut clean through between the D-ring and the buckle. Not torn, cut. One edge was clean enough that it might have been done with a knife. He picked it up. The leather was still faintly warm. He stood up. The smell was wrong. He told me this several times, and each time he struggled to describe it accurately, which I think is itself part of the description. It wasn't decay. He was clear about that. It wasn't the smell of a dead animal, which he knew well from hunting and from the times he'd helped his neighbor with livestock. It was more organic than chemical, but hotter than it should have been, like standing close to a living thing that produced more heat than its size should allow. Faintly mineral. The closest thing he could compare it to, and he hedged this comparison, was the smell of a dog kennel on a hot summer day, the ammonia of animal musk, the warmth of bodies, the particular density of a predator's scent, but turned up past anything a domestic dog could produce. He said it made his eyes water slightly in the cold air. Not from emotion, the way your eyes water in a sharp wind. He found what was left of Burl near the far bank. I'm not going to describe it in detail. Dale described it to me in detail, and I wrote down what he said, and then I made a decision about what to include here. What he found was consistent with a large predator feeding quickly and efficiently. It was not consistent with any predator he had knowledge of. The amount of ground that was affected and the completeness of what he found told him that whatever had done this had not been in a hurry and had not been wasteful. He stood there for a moment, and then he looked up from what was on the ground and looked north across the creek bed. The thing was already there. It was standing in the shadow of the north bank, maybe 40 yards away, where the root walls met the tree line, standing upright, fully upright, with a slight forward lean to its shoulders that was more like posture than an actual forward cant of the spine. Dale estimated 8 feet. He was looking at it across a flat, open stretch of sand in diffuse morning light, with clear sight lines, and he estimated 8 feet, broad through the chest and shoulders, with arms that hung at its sides past where they should have ended if they had been arms built on a human proportion. Dark fur, not black, but dark brown with enough black mixed in that the shadows of the creek bank made it nearly invisible until it moved. It was facing him. Dale told me he did not process what he was seeing in any coherent sequence. He didn't work through it in steps. It was more like all the information arrived at once, and his body responded before his brain had finished taking inventory. His hands closed around his bow. He did not raise it. He said he was not sure he could have at that moment if he had tried. The fur was the first thing his brain actually cataloged. He'd been in the field long enough to develop an automatic inventory of large animal appearances at distance, and fur at 40 yards in morning light has a particular quality, a depth to it, a way it catches light differently from a coat or a tarp, or another visual texture his brain might grab at to explain away what he was seeing. This was fur. Not the short, dense fur of a bear or the thin, slightly glossy coat of a large dog. It was long and coarse, longer at the shoulders and upper back, with something that could almost be called a ridge along the spine where the fur stood up slightly. The brown-black color was not uniform. The lower parts of the limbs were darker, and there was a tawny quality along the sides where the trunk was widest, like the layered coloring of an animal that had evolved in deep forest, where multiple shades of brown and black blur into shadow better than any single color. The smell was much stronger now. He said it hit him when he stepped into the creek bed, and it was thick enough that he felt it in his sinuses, a physical weight to it, that same dense, hot animal musk from the trail, but layered now with something else underneath, something he struggled to describe. He tried several times. The closest he got, and he kept qualifying it, was the smell of a very large dog that has been wet and then dried many times without being washed. The smell of an animal's living heat. He said it wasn't unpleasant in isolation. It was just overwhelming, and it was the smell of something much bigger than anything that smell should have been attached to, the face. He described the face to me carefully, the way he described everything, and I want to pass that on to you the same way. The muzzle was long, longer than a dog's, he said, more pointed than a wolf's. The ears sat high on the head, forward-facing in the way of a predator, and they moved independently as he watched, each tracking a separate bearing. The eyes were forward-positioned and dark, and in the low light of the creek bed he could not see their color clearly, but the eyes were aware. Not in the way of the deer he'd spent years observing at distance, which had a kind of flat watchfulness, a prey animal's constant broad scan. These eyes were focused. They were on him in the specific way that something focuses on a single point of interest, and he had the sensation of being measured, not in an abstract way, but precisely the way you feel when someone is evaluating whether you're going to do something they've already planned a response for. He stood there. He estimated it was 30 to 45 seconds, though he acknowledged under my questioning that time was not running reliably for him at that moment. The thing did not move. It stood at the edge of the shadow with what he could only call stillness. Not the frozen stillness of an animal that has seen a threat, but the chosen stillness of something that saw no reason to move yet. Its weight was on both feet, fully settled, not coiled or braced. If it had a posture equivalent to relaxed, this was it. Dale's hands had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. He noticed his grip on the bow riser had tightened involuntarily, and he consciously loosened it because holding something too hard is how you lose fine motor control, and at that moment he understood on a cellular level that he might need fine motor control very soon. He did not knock an arrow. He told me later he thought about it and rejected it, not because it felt futile, though it probably would have been, but because raising a bow to something that hadn't threatened him yet felt like the wrong opening move in a situation where the wrong move was likely to be final. He stood still and looked at it, and it stood still and looked at him. It had been waiting. That was the part Dale kept returning to in our conversation, and the part I keep returning to when I think about his account. He came to the end of a 2-mile trail, and the thing that had laid the trail was already at the destination. It had set the path going out and then returned and waited. It had spent some time in this creek bed before Dale arrived, and it had chosen the creek bed for specific reasons. Closed overhead, high banks on both sides, soft ground that showed tracks, sand that carried smell, that made it an ideal location for something that wanted to know where a person was standing at all times. Dale stood in the center of that creek bed with 40 yards of open sand between him and the thing on the north bank. He did not run. I asked him why, and he said he didn't know, except that running felt like the wrong answer in the same way that turning your back on a situation you don't fully understand always feels wrong. He said his body decided before he did. He started backing up, very slowly, step by step, toward the south bank where he'd come down. The thing on the north bank watched him. When Dale had moved back about 10 feet, the thing stepped away from the shadow of the bank and came fully into the light of the creek bed. Not toward him. It moved laterally, walking parallel to his direction of retreat, keeping the same 40-yard distance. Walking on 2 feet, with a gait that was long-strided and completely silent on the sand. He could hear his own boots on the gravel. He could not hear it moving at all. The disproportion between its size and its silence was the thing he came back to most. He described it as the most wrong thing about the whole encounter, and he had a lot of wrong things to choose from. He described the gait to me with the same care he gave other details when he wanted me to understand he'd observed closely rather than glanced and remembered. The stride was long, considerably longer than a human stride of that height would produce, covering maybe 4.5 to 5 feet per step. The foot strike was the part that made no acoustic sense. Sand carries vibration. Dale could feel his own footfalls as pressure through the soles of his boots. Something 8 feet tall and broad through the chest, crossing dry sand at a walking pace should have produced vibration he could feel and sound he could hear. At 40 yards in a quiet creek bed, it produced neither. The arms moved in a slight counterswing with each stride the way a person's arms swing when walking, but the range of motion was longer, the hands passing further forward and back, which gave the movement a quality he struggled to name. He kept trying different words and landing on the same one: patient. It moved with the patience of a creature built for ground it owned completely. At several points during the retreat, when Dale glanced left to check its position, it had already adjusted to match his bearing. Not catching up, not falling behind, keeping exactly 40 yards of lateral distance as he backed toward the south bank. It was tracking him with precision, which meant it was measuring him continuously, which meant the 40 yards was not incidental. It was a chosen distance, the distance at which you can see everything you need to see about what you're watching. Dale's breathing had gone shallow in the way that shock narrows your breath, and he was aware of it and tried to regulate it and found he couldn't fully. His hands were still on the bow. He hadn't knocked an arrow, and he didn't knock one during the retreat. Not because the earlier decision still felt strategically clean, though it did, but because his hands weren't operating at full function, and knocking an arrow requires a precision he wasn't certain he had. He backed up one step at a time, kept his face toward the far bank, and the thing moved with him, and the creek bed between them stayed exactly as wide as the thing chose to keep it. It walked parallel to him for roughly 50 feet before stopping. It stood at the far end of the creek bed with its weight slightly forward, watching him reach the south bank and start climbing. He got up the clay bank. He did not look away from it while he climbed. It had not moved. He reached the tree line and backed into the pines until a hemlock trunk was at his shoulder, and for the first time in the past 4 minutes, he was no longer in direct sight of the creek bed floor. He turned and walked. Then he walked faster. Then, about 200 yards from the creek bed where the pines thinned enough that he could move without ducking, he ran. He ran for a quarter mile. Then he stopped and listened for a full minute, heartbeat loud in his ears, breath coming hard in the cold air. Nothing behind him. He walked the rest of the way back to camp without stopping. The Silverado started on the first turn. He was on the gravel 2-track heading south before 6:30 in the morning. He drove to Crandon, 45 minutes on county roads, not thinking about anything in particular, not processing, just driving with the heat on high and both hands on the wheel. He stopped at a gas station on Highway 8 and bought coffee in a paper cup and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes watching two guys loading an ATV into a trailer across the street. Normal October morning in Forest County. People and their trucks and their gear, and none of them knowing what was in the timber 12 miles north. He drove to the Forest County Sheriff's Department on South Lake Avenue and went inside. He'd sat in the gas station parking lot for 10 minutes before he was ready to do it. He'd drunk the coffee and watched the two guys with the ATV trailer, and the whole time he'd been doing a kind of internal editing, running the full account and removing pieces. The snap clip, out. The even spacing of the blood drops, out. The bipedal prints in the drainage clay and the sand, out. What was in the creek bed, out. The thing in the creek bed, watching him back up the south bank, out. What was left when you took those pieces out was a story about an older dog with a bad knee who had gotten loose from camp in the night, which was a story you could tell to a deputy at 8 in the morning without watching his face change. The editing took about 8 minutes. He was thorough about it because he understood that if he started talking and the wrong detail came out, the conversation changed entirely. It became a welfare check. It became a man in his 50s who had driven to the sheriff's office alone with no dog and a story that didn't hold. He knew which version of this conversation he could survive and which version he couldn't. The deputy behind the counter was a young guy, maybe 26, with the flat professional expression of a public servant who has learned to keep his reactions off his face. Dale told him he had a missing hunting dog. He described Burl, blue-tick coonhound, 7 years old, 68 pounds, black and tan, distinctive ticking pattern. He said the dog had gotten loose from camp the night before, and he'd followed what he thought was the dog's trail for a couple of miles before losing it in the timber north of his lease. He said the dog was older, had a bad knee, and he was worried the animal had gone into the forest and couldn't get back. He did not mention the snap clip. He did not mention the bipedal prints. He said nothing about the creek bed or what he'd found there or what had been standing on the far bank. He filed a missing animal report, collected a case number, thanked the deputy, and left. He told me that he felt, sitting across that counter giving a half-true account of what had happened, exactly like a person who has had a psychotic episode trying to describe it to a doctor. Not because he doubted what he'd seen, he didn't doubt it then and doesn't now, but he understood in real time the complete impossibility of describing it to someone who had no framework to receive it. You can walk into a Forest County Sheriff's office and file a missing dog report. You cannot explain the snap clip and the bipedal prints and the thing standing 8 feet tall in the shadow of a root wall and expect a functional outcome from that conversation. Dale was 50 years old when he made that calculation. He knew when an explanation served a purpose and when it didn't. He drove home to Green Bay, did not go back to the lease, called the timber company 2 weeks later, and told them he'd be letting the lease go. They thanked him, and that was that. 22 years of October mornings tied to that piece of ground, and he walked away from it in a 2-minute phone call without regret. Tim Went was his hunting partner, a guy he'd known since high school who worked as a trim carpenter out of Appleton and had hunted with Dale on the lease every October for 11 years. Tim had been supposed to come up for the second weekend, but had backed out the week before because of a renovation job in Neenah that was still 2 days from finishing. He'd called Dale the Wednesday before, apologized, said he'd make it up next season. Dale told him no problem. If Tim had been in camp that Thursday night, the night goes differently. A second person in or near the camper. More noise, more smell, more human presence. Whatever assessed that camp and made its plan had assessed a single man, a single dog, no backup, no communication. It had made a correct assessment. When Dale finally told Tim what had happened, they were sitting in Tim's garage in Appleton in January of 2018. Tim had a wood stove going, and they'd been talking about nothing for an hour before Dale said he needed to talk. He told it straight through without stopping. He said Tim sat on his shop stool for the whole thing without moving, without asking a question, without the kind of placed skeptical pause that friends use to signal how seriously they're taking what they're hearing. He just listened. When Dale finished, Tim was quiet for a long time, maybe 2 minutes, which is a long silence between men who've known each other since high school. Then, Tim said he believed him. Not, "I believe you saw what you think you saw." Not, "I'm sure there's an explanation." Just the sentence, plain, with its full weight. "I believe you." He told Dale that he'd had his own experience in the Chequamegon side of the forest, the western unit, spring turkey season, years earlier, that he'd never told anyone. He didn't describe it in detail. He didn't say what he'd seen or what had happened or why he'd never mentioned it in 11 years of sharing that lease. Just said he was glad Dale had come back. That told Dale a lot about what Tim had seen. Dale told me that the conversation in Tim's garage was the closest he came in the year after the encounter to being able to put the whole thing down. Not because Tim's experience validated his, though it did, but because the weight of carrying a story that no one else has any purchase on is specific and exhausting in a way that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't done it. Having one person sit across from you and say they believe you, with the particular directness Tim used, changes the load. It doesn't make the story make more sense, but it makes you less alone in it, which is a different kind of relief. Tim didn't go back to his turkey spot after that conversation. Dale noticed he never mentioned it again. Some things you share once, and then you both put them down and leave them there. The SD card had 418 images on it from the previous week. The Stealth Cam G 45NG fires on motion detection and timestamps each frame. Dale went through them on his laptop the week after Thanksgiving. Most were deer movement, the black bear returning twice, a coyote passing through once, and a lot of wind-triggered frames from a poplar branch that the camera had partially in frame. At 2:47 inches the morning on October 27th, the camera fired 3 frames in sequence. The first frame showed the game trail in the white oak base and a normal night black background. Motion trigger, nothing immediately visible. The second frame was the same, normal frame, dark background, the trail empty. The third frame had something at the extreme right edge of the image. The camera's effective no-glow range at night is about 50 feet, and whatever was in that frame was at roughly that limit, 40 to 50 yards out, beyond the sharpest focal plane. The image was dark. The shape was indistinct, but it was there, upright, tall enough that the top of the shape cleared the lower pine branches on the right side of the frame, which Dale later measured at approximately 7 feet, 2 inches off the ground. The shape wasn't facing the camera. It was turned slightly away, at a 3/4 angle, the near shoulder visible against the dark tree background. He had a wildlife biologist at the University of Wisconsin's Cooperative Extension Office in Green Bay look at the image the following spring. The biologist's response, which Dale relayed to me word for word, was that the image showed a large mammal, possibly a bear in a bipedal posture, at the edge of infrared range. He had seen the image and was offering an explanation that fit within his professional framework. Dale did not argue with him. He thanked him and left. When Dale sent me the image, I looked at it for a long time. The shape has the proportions of something tall and large and standing on 2 limbs. The shoulder line is too high for a bear standing up. The shape of the upper body doesn't match a bear's silhouette. Bears, when they stand upright, have a distinctive profile created by their forelegs hanging in front of their body. This shape's arms appear to hang at its sides. I had someone I trust look at it who has a background in image analysis. His assessment was that the image hadn't been altered and that what was in frame was what was in front of the camera when the shutter fired. The image was taken at 2:47 inches the morning. Dale had woken up at 4:47. In the 2 hours between those times, whatever was in that image had moved from 80 yards north of the camper to close enough to the truck to work the snap clip. Burl had not barked. A blue-tick coonhound that has been trained on bear scent does not go quietly. Whatever came into that camp either moved faster than the dog could respond to, or it approached from the downwind side with enough care that Burl was taken before he had time to react. Dale's camp setup put the prevailing wind from the northwest. The camera was north of camp. The thing in the image was slightly north-northwest of the camera. After Dale's account, I spent several months looking for other documented incidents from Forest County and the surrounding areas of the Nicolay unit. What I found was thinner than I wanted it to be and more consistent than I expected. Between 1,989 and 2,019, I located 11 reported incidents of large bipedal figures observed in the northern Nicolay unit, not through any official registry, because nothing like that exists for this kind of report, but through a combination of hunting forum posts, BFRO database submissions that describe something too canine for the database's usual taxonomy, and 2 accounts that found their way to me directly through other contacts in the years after I started this research. Most of the reports came from deer and bear hunters. 2 came from people hiking the North Country National Scenic Trail, which passes through this section of the forest. The Ojibwe people, whose ancestral territory covered this part of northern Wisconsin, had extensive oral traditions about beings associated with the deep forest that existed outside ordinary animal categories. The Wendigo is the most widely known of these, but the Wendigo in traditional Ojibwe oral literature is a distinct kind of being, associated with winter starvation and a specific kind of spiritual corruption. It isn't the right category for what Dale described. The Meme-Gwashi, small beings sometimes described as half-human and associated with rocky waterways, also don't match. But there are older stories, less widely circulated in the scholarly literature, documented by ethnographers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when working with Ojibwe communities in northern Wisconsin, that describe large, predatory forest beings that operated with strategic intelligence. Stories about the forest taking hunters, about being watched from trees in a particular stretch of timber, about the dangerous knowledge that if you went far enough north of a certain landmark, you were being tracked from the moment you entered. Those stories are harder to find. They weren't given freely to outside researchers, but they exist, and the geography they describe, loosely translated from the oral specifics, overlaps with what is now the northern Nicolay unit. I don't have a clean answer for Dale. I didn't tell him I did. What I've been able to establish is this. The trail camera image is real. The snap clip mechanism was physically operated. The bipedal prints in the drainage clay were consistent with a large 2-footed animal that does not exist in any current scientific register for northern Wisconsin. The blood trail was produced by a carrier, moving a 68-pound dog over 2 miles of rough terrain at night without making a sound audible to a sleeping man 30 feet away. And the thing Dale encountered at the creek bed was waiting for him, not driving him somewhere, not warning him off, waiting at a destination it had created, holding a space it had chosen with whatever patience it required. What I keep coming back to is the collar, the leather cut clean through, the buckle still done up, not torn off in a struggle, cut. And the clip at the camp, opened deliberately rather than broken. There's a specific intelligence visible in those 2 details that sits differently from any predator behavior I've been able to find documentation for. A predator that tears through obstacles to get what it wants. This removed them. It opened things. It was operating with a category of patience and precision that was not about getting Burl out of the situation quickly. It was about getting Dale into a situation specifically 2 miles from his camp alone at a location it had selected. Dale drives up to Rhinelander once a year to fish. He takes County 8 north out of the city, and he's through the Forest County line in about 20 minutes, and the landscape is the same. Same pines, same county roads, same light on late-season grass. He told me he doesn't think about what's in the forest when he drives through it. He said he made a decision, somewhere in the year after the encounter, not to think about what the forest contains. The decision holds most of the time. Some mornings, he said, he wakes up at 4:47 and he knows there's no particular reason for it. Burl's collar is in a shoebox on a shelf in his garage. He told me this at the end of our last conversation in a way that didn't invite a response. I didn't give him one. If you hunt the Chequamegon Nicolay or any forest in this part of the state, I'm not going to tell you to stop. I'm going to tell you to pay attention to the small things. The snap clip you know you latched. The blood trail that doesn't look like a blood trail should. The trail camera image, where the shape doesn't match any size on the Wisconsin mammal list. Pay attention to those things before you go a half mile in, because by the time you're 2 miles north and looking across a dry creek bed, the choice is already behind you. I'll say one more thing and then I'll let this sit. The thing in that creek bed did not pursue Dale when he retreated. It walked parallel to him for 50 feet and then stopped. That is not the behavior of an ambush predator that failed. An ambush predator closes the distance. It doesn't hold position. What Dale described was something that was done, that had completed a task and was watching to see the result and then let him go. The trap was successful. Burl was gone. The man had been brought to a specific place and allowed to see what was there, and then allowed to leave. I've thought about what the purpose of that is for a long time. I don't have a satisfying answer. What I have is this. Dale Voigt never went back to Forest County. He let the lease expire. He stopped using that piece of ground. Whatever ran the North Nicolay timber now runs it without him. Maybe that was the point. Of those 11 reports, 2 are worth describing in detail because they connect to Dale's account in ways that are hard to set aside. The first came from a bear hunter who had been working a bait site about 7 miles northeast of where Dale leased his ground in the fall of 2009. This hunter, I'm using the name Gary in this account because he gave me permission to share his account but asked that his last name stay out of it, had been hunting the same bait site for 4 years. His site was a 55-gallon barrel filled with a standard attractant mix, mounted to a poplar about 100 yards off a logging road in the northern Nicolay. He hunted it from a box blind at 25 yards. On the 3rd night of the season, he arrived at his blind at 4 in the afternoon and found the barrel gone. Not knocked over, not rolled. The barrel weighed 230 pounds when full, was secured to the tree with a lag bolt and a chain, and the chain had been removed from the tree. The lag bolt was still in the bark. The chain and the barrel were found 60 yards away, the barrel turned upside down and completely emptied. Gary attributed it to a large bear. He told me this straightforwardly and without evident doubt. I asked him if bears in northern Wisconsin typically unhook chain mechanisms. He was quiet for a moment and said they can manipulate all kinds of things, and he'd seen them do impressive work. He sounded like a man talking himself into something he'd talked himself into before. He didn't see anything that season. The following year, he didn't go back. The second report came from a woman named Diane Schroeder, a retired school teacher from Rhinelander who had hiked a section of the North Country National Scenic Trail every fall for 20-some years as a personal tradition. The North Country NST runs through the northern Nicolay, roughly parallel to the Rat River corridor, and in that section is genuinely remote. No roads within several miles in either direction for long stretches. In September of 2014, she was hiking a day section alone, which she'd done many times, and stopped for lunch at a log near a creek crossing. She heard something moving in the brush parallel to the trail, upstream, at a distance she estimated as 60 to 80 yards. It moved with her, she said, for approximately 20 minutes, staying in the thick brush alongside the creek, never showing itself but never stopping either, not circling, moving with her in the same direction at roughly the same pace. She'd hiked with bears in close proximity before and said this didn't feel like a bear. The sound was too deliberate, the intervals between steps too even, the persistence too sustained. She picked up her pace. The sound picked up with her. She moved to nearly a jog, and the sound kept pace. She said she was not terrified in the way that a physical threat produces terror. It was more like the feeling of being followed by something that was making sure she knew it was there. She completed the trail section and reached her car and drove directly to Rhinelander. She didn't hike that section the next fall, and the fall after that she went to the Porcupine Mountains in Michigan instead. What these accounts have in common with Dale's, and with the others in the set I compiled, is the behavioral signature, active awareness of specific humans, deliberate engagement calibrated to produce a specific response, movement and decision-making that shows a working model of how the targeted person would behave. These are not the behaviors of an apex predator hunting. They're the behaviors of an entity that understands its environment in terms of how the humans in it will react. One that has a theory of mind, to use the clinical term. Animals with a confirmed theory of mind in scientific literature include great apes, ravens, dolphins, elephants, and domestic dogs. They model other individuals' mental states and make predictions about behavior. Whatever is in the northern Nicolet timber has learned to model humans well enough to lay a 2-mile trap, wait at the end of it, and then allow the person to leave. I've tried to understand why it allowed Dale to leave. He was alone. He was 12 miles from the nearest highway with a phone at 10% and no cell signal. He was at the end of a 2-mile trail in a terrain feature specifically chosen to have no obvious escape route. If the thing in that creek bed had wanted to ensure Dale Voigt never drove back to Green Bay on Highway 8, it had every condition it needed. It had set those conditions deliberately, and then it didn't use them. The only framing that makes sense to me, and I want to be clear that this is the framing I've arrived at after 5 years of working on Dale's account and the broader catalog of reports from this area, not a conclusion I'm claiming as fact, is that what happened in that creek bed on the morning of the 27th of October 2017 was a communication. Not formal, not linguistic, something operating at a level below language, a demonstration of capability followed by restraint. Burl was gone. The conditions were created, and then the conditions were released. The thing that built that trap showed Dale, standing in the center of it, exactly what it had and exactly what it chose not to do. After that morning, Dale never went back. The ground north of that lease now runs without him in it. Whether that was the purpose, I can't say. Whether there is a purpose at all in the human sense of a goal that is pursued and achieved, I can't say that either. What I can say is that it worked. The outcome it produced, whatever the mechanism, was the removal of a man from a piece of ground he had occupied for 22 years. Whatever that ground is used for now, it isn't used by Dale Voigt. He still wakes up at 4:47 some mornings. He made coffee. He looked out the window at the Green Bay sky. He told me that sometimes he wonders if Burl felt it coming, in the way dogs feel things that humans don't register. He said he hoped not. He said Burl was a good dog and deserved the quiet he'd had in his old age. He kept the collar in the shoebox. He said he didn't know why. Some things you just keep. I'll leave it there.